Harlan Voss slammed his palm flat on the trading post counter, so hard the tin cups rattled off their hooks and clattered across the floor, and every person in that room went still. "You want to sell something?" His voice didn't rise. That was the worst part. It stayed low and flat and mean, the way a man speaks when he knows he doesn't have to shout to make someone feel small. He looked Marin Belrose up and down slowly, deliberately, the way you'd inspect a horse you'd already decided wasn't worth buying. "You? In my town?" Marin stood at the counter with a folded canvas blanket under one arm and her chin up, though anyone paying close attention would have seen her other hand gripping the edge of her coat hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "I'm just asking you to look at the work," she said. "That's all." Harlan laughed. Not a real laugh, a performance of one, aimed at the three men standing behind him who obligingly smiled. "Honey, I sell real goods in this store. Not charity projects from women who can't find a husband." He reached over and flicked the edge of her blanket with 2 fingers, like he was touching something dirty. "Go find a kitchen somewhere. That's where you belong." Marin didn't move. Harlan leaned forward across the counter. "I said go," she went. "And if you want to know how a woman like Marin Belrose, poor, dismissed, and carrying a dead man's unfinished promise, stood back up after that moment and built something that made Harlan Voss swallow every one of those words, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see just how far these stories travel. Now, sit back, because this one's going to take a while to tell, and every minute of it is worth your time. The morning Wade Hollowell rode up to his father's grave. He wasn't expecting company. He'd been putting off the visit for 3 months, not because he didn't care, or that's what he told himself anyway, but because there was always something that needed doing first. Fence line on the north pasture, cattle that needed moving before the first hard freeze, paperwork from the bank that he'd been ignoring since before Orson died and couldn't put off much longer. 3 months of excuses. And now October had arrived in full, the hills gone yellow and brown, the air carrying that particular bite that told you winter wasn't asking permission this year, and Wade had run out of things to hide behind. He tied his horse at the base of the hill and climbed on foot the way he always had since he was a boy, because Orson had once told him a man ought to approach the dead with his boots on the ground and his hat in his hand. Wade wasn't sure he believed that anymore. He wasn't sure what he believed about his father, period. But his hat was in his hand anyway, out of habit, and his boots crunched through the dry grass, and he came over the top of the rise and stopped dead. There was a woman kneeling beside the grave. She hadn't heard him. She was turned away, her shoulders rounded, her head bowed, and she had both hands pressed flat against the dirt in front of the wooden marker, the way you'd press your hands against something warm for the last time before leaving it. She was crying not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet, exhausted way that suggested she'd been crying for a while and had long since stopped fighting it. Wade stood there a moment, genuinely unsure what to do. His first instinct was to back away quietly and come back later, which struck him immediately as ridiculous it was his father's grave. His second instinct was to say something, which struck him as worse, because he had no idea what to say. He must have shifted his weight, because a dry twig snapped underfoot, and the woman's head came up fast. She twisted around to look at him, and Wade saw her clearly for the first time. She was young mid-20s, maybe with a full, round face still wet with tears, thick chestnut hair that had mostly escaped, whatever she'd tried to do with it that morning, and hazel eyes that went from startled to wary to something more complicated in about 2 seconds flat. She was heavyset, broad through the shoulders and hips, the kind of solid, substantial build that frontier women sometimes had when they'd spent their lives actually working. Her dress was faded. Her coat had been patched at both elbows. Her boots had seen 4 or 5 Wyoming winters and weren't eager for another. Scrambled to her feet. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was coming." "Neither did I," Wade said. It came out flatter than he intended. He cleared his throat. "Who are you?" Something shifted in her expression. Not offense, exactly. More like she was accustomed to the question being asked that way, direct and suspicious, and had made a kind of peace with it. "Marin Belrose," she said. "I knew your father. My father's been dead 3 months." I've spoken to everyone who knew him. No, she said quietly. You haven't. That hung in the air between them. Wade looked at her steadily, the way he'd learned to look at people when he was trying to figure out if they were lying. She looked back at him, without flinching, and without the particular anxious brightness that liars usually got when they were waiting to see if you believed them. She was just waiting. How'd you know him? He asked. He found me outside Culver's trading post about 2 winters back. I was trying to figure out if I could afford enough salt pork to last the week. She said it without embarrassment, the way you state a fact. He bought it for me. I told him I didn't take charity. He told me it wasn't charity, it was an advance, and then he asked to see what I was carrying in my pack. What were you carrying? Samples. I sew. Livestock blankets, mainly reinforced canvas with wool batting, double-stitched seams. I'd been trying to sell them to ranchers and merchants for 2 seasons and getting nowhere. Her mouth tightened briefly. Your father looked at one of them for about 30 seconds and said, "This is good work. Who've you shown it to?" I told him about Culver and the Deacon brothers and Harlan Voss. He asked what they'd said. I told him. He was quiet a minute, and then he said, "Come back tomorrow and bring your tools." Wade stared at her. He said that, yes. Orson Hollowell told a woman he'd met outside a trading post to come back with her tools. That's right. My father, Wade said, barely said 10 words a day his entire life. Marin looked at him steadily. He said plenty to me. Something about that landed harder than Wade expected. He didn't know what to do with it, so he looked away, out over the yellow hills, and let the silence sit there while he got himself sorted. After a moment, Marin reached into her coat. She pulled out an envelope. Orson's handwriting was on the front. Wade recognized it immediately. His father had written like a man who'd learned late, and thought every letter mattered, careful and slightly cramped, each word taking up a little more space than it needed to. The name on the front wasn't Wade's, it was Marin's. He gave this to Culver to hold, Marin said, with instructions to give it to me after she stopped. Swallowed. After he was gone. Culver gave it to me last week. She held it out to Wade. I think you should read it first. It's addressed to you. I know, but there's something in it you need to know about, and I don't, she exhaled. I'd rather you read it and ask your questions after. It'll go easier that way. Wade looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he took it. He didn't open it right away. He stood there with it in his hand and looked down at his father's grave at the wooden marker with Orson James Hollowell and the dates. The mound of dirt that had settled some but still had the slight awkwardness of newness, the dry grass around it that nobody had cleared. You came out here today, he said. Just to be here. Yes. Not looking for anything. No, her voice was quiet. He was kind to me. People aren't always kind. I wanted to, I don't know. Say thank you again, even though he can't hear it. Wade put his hat back on. He looked at her once more, this woman he'd never met, kneeling in the dirt beside his father's grave to thank a man who couldn't hear her. He didn't know what to make of her. He didn't know what to make of any of this. Come down to the house, he said. I'll read this, and then we'll talk. Marin sat at the kitchen table while Wade read the letter. He read it twice, the second time more slowly, stopping at certain passages and going back to them. Marin sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes somewhere on the middle distance, not watching him, but not watching him either, in the way of someone trying to give a person privacy while sharing a room with them. When Wade set the letter down, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, He bought you a sewing machine, yes. It's in Culver's back room. He paid for it 6 months before he died and told Culver to hold it. Yes, along with he'd been collecting materials. Canvas, wool, some leather tools. I didn't know until Culver told me last week. Marin's voice was careful. I didn't ask him to do any of that. I want you to know that. I know, Wade said it quickly, without accusation. He looked at the letter again. He says here he paused. He says you designed a blanket that should have sold and didn't. That the problem wasn't the blanket. Harlan Voss told ranchers not to buy from me. She said it plainly. He didn't want the competition, and he knew if he laughed at me enough times in public, no one would take me seriously. Worked. For how long? 2 years. Wade's jaw tightened. He picked up the letter again and read a section near the end once more, his lips moving slightly. Then he put it down. He wants me to give you space in one of the ranch buildings, he said, so you can produce the blankets properly, at scale. Says. Marin was watching him now. I don't expect you to honor it. It was his idea, not yours, and you don't know me. I just wanted you to hear it from the letter and not from someone else. You walked all the way out here to tell me that. I walked out here to visit his grave, she said. I told you that already. The letter is a separate thing. Wade leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way men did when they were thinking something through and didn't particularly want an audience for the thinking. Then he came back down and looked at her. What's wrong with the blankets you have? The ones you're selling now? I can only make 2 or 3 a week by myself, working evenings after my other work is done. Harlan sells his in bulk at a lower price because he orders them from a manufacturer back east. They're thinner. They don't hold up past midwinter. But most ranchers won't pay more per blanket unless they can see the difference clearly, side by side, and Harlan's made sure that comparison never happens. She paused. If I had a proper space to work and a few women helping me, I could produce enough volume to actually put my blankets in front of people. Let them judge for themselves. And if they judge wrong, then I find another way. Her voice didn't waver. But they should at least get the chance to judge. Wade picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. He looked at the letter. He looked at the woman across the table from him. He thought about his father, stern, sparse with words, tighter with affection than most people needed a father to be buying a sewing machine in secret and stacking canvas in a back room, and writing a letter to a woman he'd known 2 years, asking his son to finish something he'd started. He thought about all the things he didn't know about the man who raised him. The old bunkhouse on the east side of the property, he said. It's empty. Has been since I sold off part of the herd 2 years ago. Marin looked at him. It needs work, Wade said. The stove needs relining. Half the floorboards are warped. But it's got windows and space, and it's better than what you're working with. I'm not asking you for, I know what you're not asking. He stood up, picked up both coffee cups, went to the stove, poured without asking if she wanted more. Set her cup back in front of her. But Orson asked. And he was right more often than I'd like to admit. He sat back down. I'll have the bunkhouse ready by the end of the week. You bring your equipment from Culver's and whatever else you need. We'll work out the arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Her voice was careful, neutral, giving nothing away. Fair one. He met her eyes. You pay what you can when you can until the space is yours. Not a gift. Not a handout. You said you don't take charity. I don't. Then it won't be charity. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. It'll be an agreement between 2 people who don't know each other yet, made on my father's recommendation, which is about as solid a foundation as most things get out here. Marison was quiet for a moment. Wade had the sense she was looking for the catch, the thing being asked for that hadn't been named yet, the price that would come due later. He understood the caution. He didn't take it personally. All right, she said finally. All right, he agreed. They drank their coffee, and the kitchen was quiet, and neither of them knew yet how wrong and how right the was going to turn out to be. Word got out by Friday. Wade hadn't announced anything. He hadn't put up a notice or sent word around. He'd simply started bringing lumber to the bunkhouse on Wednesday morning, and by Thursday 2 of his ranch hands were helping with the floorboards. And by Friday morning, Marin had brought her first load of materials from Culver's storage in a borrowed wagon, and that was enough. In a territory this size, that was more than enough. The first one to say something was Deke Pruitt, who ran the feed store 3 miles down the main road and had opinions about everything, delivered at volume, whether you wanted them or not. He came out to Hollowell Ranch on Friday afternoon, ostensibly to return a borrowed tool, actually to look. He stood in the bunkhouse doorway watching Marin arrange her workspace, the new sewing machine bolted to a heavy table, the fabric shelves going up along the west wall, the cutting table in the center, and he said, to no one in particular, "So the widow woman's going into business, is she?" Marin wasn't a widow. She didn't correct him. "I'm going into business," she said. "Yes. Making what exactly?" "Livestock blankets, to start. Canvas work, repairs, winter goods." Deke made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Harlan's not going to like that. Harlan doesn't have to like it. Deke looked at Wade, who was relining the stove, and pointedly not looking back. You sure about this, Hollowell? Sure about having someone use an empty building? Wade set down his trowel. Yeah, I'm sure. People are going to say things. People say things regardless. Wade went back to the stove. Pass me that trowel handle, would you? Deke passed it, looked at Marin once more, looked at the sewing machine, looked at the stacks of canvas, and left. By Sunday, Marin had heard 3 different versions of what Deke had said around town. In the most dramatic version, Wade Hollowell had lost his mind with grief and was setting up a charity house for strays on his father's property. In the mildest version, there was a large woman of questionable background living in the Hollowell bunkhouse for reasons nobody could adequately explain. She heard these things through Clara Finch, who took in laundry at the edge of town, and had the particular combination of a generous heart and excellent ears that made her invaluable as an early warning system. How bad? Marin asked. Not terrible yet, Clara said. Give it a week. What's Harlan saying? Clara's expression shifted. Harlan saying you'd do better to take the job he offered you last spring. 12 hours a day in his stockroom, sorting inventory. He offered me 12 hours a day at a rate I couldn't live on, and told me I should be grateful because nobody else would hire me. Marin kept her hands moving on the fabric she was cutting. Told him no, he's telling it different, he would. The scissors moved clean and straight through the canvas. What else? He's put it around that your blankets fall apart after the first hard winter. That 2 ranchers tried them and returned them. Clara watched Marin's face. That's a lie. I know those ranchers. Neither of them said any such thing. Marin set down the scissors. She picked them up again. How many people believe it? Some. Enough. Clara looked uncomfortable. Marin, you're asking people to choose your product over his, and he's been here longer and sells everything they need, and you're new, and she stopped. And I'm what I am, Marin said flatly, and I look like what I look like. And people believe what Harlan tells them because it's easier than thinking for themselves. She picked up the scissors again. That's not new information, Clara. Tell me something I don't know. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the Pearson Ranch lost 4 animals last February. Harlan's blankets. Orson told me that. Said it was a waste and an avoidable one. Marin looked up. Nobody knows that story, Clara said. Because Pearson didn't want to admit he'd bought cheap, and it cost him. But it's true, and Orson knew it. The scissors sat still on the table. Marin stared at the canvas in front of her, thinking something through. Can Pearson be talked to, she asked. Maybe. He's a stubborn man, Clara paused. But he's an honest one. It was the 2nd week of October when the cold came early. Not a gradual autumn cool down. A hard driving cold that dropped out of the north overnight and announced itself through cracked window frames and water that froze in the troughs before dawn. Old-timers said it was the earliest hard freeze they'd seen in 15 years. Harlan Voss's supply shipment was 3 weeks out. Marin heard this from Clara on a Tuesday morning. She sat with the information for about 30 seconds. Then she went and found Wade. He was at the corral fence, watching the sky with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. How many ranchers in this county run livestock that need blanketing? She asked, without preamble. He looked at her. 15, maybe 18, depending on what they're keeping. Harlan's stock is 3 weeks out, I heard. I can make 12 blankets a week if I work full days. Maybe 14. She looked at him steadily. That's not enough. No, he agreed, it's not. Clara Finch needs work. She's strong and she can follow instruction. Dora Payne at the edge of the Marsh Creek Road is a capable seamstress. She's been doing piecework for almost nothing. Because Harlan's the only one offering it. Marin counted on her fingers. If I had 2 more women working alongside me, starting today. You'd need more materials. I have the canvas your father stockpiled. I need wool batting and more thread. She watched him. I'm not asking you to buy it. I'm telling you what I need so you know what I'm planning, and so that if you happen to be riding past Culver's today. I'll be at Culver's by noon, Wade said. If you buy the materials, I'll pay you back from the first order that fills. I know you will. I'm not saying it to be polite. I'm saying it because it matters to me. He looked at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, not pity, which she was used to, not admiration, which she didn't quite trust. Something quieter than either. I'll be at Culver's by noon, he said again. Get Clara and Dora. I'll have the materials there by evening. They worked for 6 days, not good days. Not the kind of days that look clean and purposeful in the retelling. These were days that started before dawn and ended after dark, when the bunkhouse smelled like raw wool and machine oil, and the particular sharp edge of women who've been working too long without enough sleep. Clara developed a blister on her right hand on day 2 and wrapped it and kept cutting. Dora Payne, who was 61 years old and had a bad knee, stood at the cutting table for 10 hours on day 3 and said nothing about the knee until she got home, and Clara told Marin about it 2 days later. Marin herself didn't sleep more than 4 hours on any given night. Wade came by mornings to check the stove and make sure there was firewood, and evenings to see what else was needed, and he mostly stayed out of the way, which was the right instinct, and Marin appreciated it. Once on day 4, he brought food, a pot of something his ranch cook had made, more food than 3 women could eat in an afternoon, and set it on the work table without comment, and left before anyone could thank him. Clara looked at the pot and then at Marin. Don't say it, Marin said, already back at the machine. I wasn't going to say anything, Clara said, and picked up her scissors. By the end of day 6, they had 23 blankets. Not all of them perfect. 2 had seeming issues Marin identified and set aside. 1 had an irregular cut in the canvas that would still function, but that she wouldn't sell at full price. 20 blankets she was willing to put her name on. 3 she'd sell at a discount with full explanation. 23 total. She stood in the middle of the bunkhouse at 11 o'clock on the 6th night, Clara and Dora already gone home, and looked at the stacked blankets, and felt a complicated thing she didn't have a good word for. Not pride, exactly. Something more cautious than pride. Particular feeling of having done what you said you'd do, and not yet knowing whether it was going to matter. Wade knocked on the open door. 23, she said, without turning. I heard. He leaned in the doorway. I've been talking to Pearson. Turned at that. He'll see you tomorrow morning, Wade said. Hear what you have to say. Does he know what it's about? He knows I asked him to listen to a woman who makes better livestock blankets than anything Harlan sells, and that his opinion matters to other ranchers in this county, and that if she's wrong, he's out nothing but an hour of his time. Wade paused. He said he'd be there at 8. Marin was quiet for a moment. And Harlan? I invited him too. Wade's voice was even. And watch. She stared at him. You invited Harlan. I figured if he's going to say your blankets don't work, he ought to be willing to say it in front of people and in front of your blankets. Wade met her eyes. You said you wanted ranchers to judge the work, not the woman. I'm trying to set up the conditions for that. Marin looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight wasn't kind or dramatic. It was just a working lamp in a working room, and they were both tired, and this was just a man telling her what he'd done. Thank you, she said. Get some sleep, he said. Pearson's punctual. He left, and Marin turned back to the stacked blankets, and the complicated, unnamed feeling settled in her chest, alongside something new, something that felt, if she was being honest, uncomfortably like hope. She'd made that mistake before. She tried not to make it again. There it was, settling in regardless, the way hope always did quietly, without asking permission, making itself at home before you thought to stop it. Turned off the lamp. She went to bed. She lay awake for 2 hours. In the morning, she got up before dawn and put on her best dress, the one that was faded but whole, the one without visible patches, and she braided her hair properly. And she looked at herself in the small clouded mirror above the washstand. And she said nothing to the woman looking back at her. There was nothing to say. The woman in the mirror was who she was. She'd either be enough tomorrow or she wouldn't. She picked up her coat, the one with the patched elbows, the only coat she had. Put it on. She went to meet Pearson. Pearson's ranch sat at the bottom of a long, shallow valley, the kind of place that caught wind from 3 directions and held it, and at 8 o'clock on an October morning, with the temperature still sitting below freezing. The cold came in, off the open ground, like something with intent. There were more people there than Marin had expected. She'd pictured Pearson, maybe 1 or 2 other ranchers, Harlan standing off to the side with his arms crossed. What she found when Wade's wagon rolled up the Pearson Drive was closer to 15 men ranchers in their hands, a couple of merchants, Deke Pruitt from the feed store with his hat pulled low, and Harlan Voss standing dead center in the yard like he'd organized the whole thing himself, which he probably had. Marin stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help. She pulled the canvas-wrapped bundle of blankets from the wagon bed herself, which was awkward because the bundle was heavy and unwieldy, and she nearly lost her footing on the frozen ground. Nobody offered to help. She got the bundle sorted, straightened up, and looked at the assembled men. Nobody said anything. They just looked at her, some with open curiosity, some with the flat, impersonal assessment of men who'd already made up their minds. Two of the younger ranch hands said something quiet to each other, and one of them smiled. Harlan stepped forward, Miss Belrose. He said it pleasantly, like he was greeting an old friend. Didn't expect to see you out this way. You were invited the same time I was, Marin said. So, I was. He glanced at Wade, who'd come around the wagon and was standing slightly behind, and to the left of Marin, close enough to be clearly associated with her, far enough to make clear this wasn't his show. Harlan's eyes moved back to Marin. Brought your blankets, I see. I did. Good, he smiled. I brought some of mine. She hadn't known that. Nothing on her face showed it. She shifted the bundle in her arms and looked at Pearson, who had come out of the house and was standing on his porch steps with the standing on his expression of a man who'd agreed to something and was only now calculating the full cost of that agreement. Mr. Pearson, she said, thank you for having us. Pearson was a big man, 50 or so, with a weathered face, and the slow, deliberate manner of someone who'd learned that most things worth doing weren't worth rushing. He looked at Marin, then at the bundle, then at Harlan's crates of merchandise sitting in the yard, then back at Marin. You said you had something worth looking at, he said. I do. Then let's look at it. He came down off the steps. I've got 8 horses that need blanketing, and I'm out of patience for this cold. What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic, in the way that people who tell the story later sometimes make it sound. There was no great speech. There was no moment where Marin stood on something high and declared herself off while the crowd fell silent. What there was work. She unwrapped her blankets on the fence rail and put them next to Harlan's. She walked through the differences, methodically, the double-stitched seams, the thickness of the wool batting, the reinforced corners that kept the blanket from shifting under an animal's movement in the night. She talked about the canvas grade she used and why it mattered in wet cold versus dry cold, which was a distinction most people hadn't thought about, but which Pearson, who'd lost animals the previous February, understood immediately. Harlan interrupted twice. The first time to point out that his blankets were cheaper per unit, which was true. The second time to suggest that Marin was overstating the durability of her stitching, at which she picked up one of her blankets and handed it to the nearest ranch hand and told him to pull it apart. The man looked at her, looked at the blanket, looked at Harlan, looked uncertain. Go ahead, Marin said. Pull the seam, both hands. Give it everything you've got. The hand shrugged and pulled. The seam held. He pulled harder, bracing one foot against the fence rail, his face going red with effort. The seam held. Someone at the back of the group said, low and not meant for general hearing. Well, damn. Harlan said, one blanket doesn't prove anything. Quality varies in any batch. Then pull one of yours, Wade said from his position at the edge of the group. Quiet settled. Harlan looked at Wade with an expression that had several layers to it, irritation on top, something more calculating underneath. He looked at his blankets on the fence rail. He looked at the group of men watching him. He picked up one of his own blankets. He pulled the seam. Steadily, not dramatically, it separated at the corner. Not completely, not a full failure, but the stitching gave about 2 inches, clean and clear, a small white gap opening in the fold. Harlan set the blanket down. He straightened his coat. Manufacturing variants, he said. Every batch has some variation. February last year, Pearson said from behind him. Harlan turned, my animals. Pearson's voice was quiet and absolutely flat. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make a fuss. But February last year, I lost animals I shouldn't have lost, and I'm standing here looking at that seam and I'm thinking about why. He looked at Harlan directly. You sold me those blankets. You told me they were the best available. Now, Ed, weather last February was. I know what the weather was. I lived through it. Pearson walked to the fence and picked up one of Marin's blankets. He turned it over in his hands, running his thumb along the seaming, checking the corners. He did it the way he'd do anything thoroughly, without hurry. He handed it to the man next to him without comment. The man looked at it and handed it to the next person. The blanket made its way down the line. Nobody said anything dramatic. Men just looked at it, felt the weight of it, checked the stitching with their fingers, the way ranchers checked everything practically, with the particular attention of people whose income depended on things holding up. Harlan watched this happen with the smile still on his face, but the smile had gone effortful. "How many can you produce?" one of the men near the back called out. A rancher named Cowboy had pointed him out on the drive over, said he ran the second largest herd in the county and was not a man who spent money carelessly. "Currently," Marin said, 20 a week with 2 other women helping. "I can increase that if the orders justify it." "Price?" He gave him the number. It was more than Harlan's price. She didn't apologize for it. Cobb looked at his hands for a moment. Did math, looked up. "What's your order lead time?" "Can have your first order ready in 10 days. "Harlan's got a shipment due in 3 weeks, someone said. "I know," Marin said. Another silence. Then Pearson said, "I'll take 8. He said it to Marin, not to anyone else. "First order. We'll see how they do this winter." "I'll take 6, said the man to Pearson's left, whose name Marin didn't know yet. Cobb said nothing for a moment. Then 10, if you can manage it. Marin did the math quickly. "I can manage it," Harlan said, loudly enough that everyone could hear. "I'd be careful about ordering from someone with no real facility, no track record, and no ability to guarantee supply." The yard went quiet again. Marin looked at Harlan. He was watching her with the pleasant, reasonable expression he seemed to be able to hold indefinitely, the face of a man who believed that if he framed everything calmly, he could say anything he wanted. "I have a facility," she said. "I have orders I've fulfilled without a complaint. And I have 20 blankets in a wagon that I made in 6 days with 2 women helping me, while you were waiting for a manufacturer 3 states away to load a cart." She paused. "What I don't have is 3 weeks' worth of cold weather to spare, and neither do your livestock." Picked up her bundle. She looked at Pearson. "I'll have your 8 ready in 8 days. You can inspect them on delivery, and if you don't want them, you owe me nothing." Pearson looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The way he'd agree to anything he'd already decided was right. On the ride back to the ranch, Wade didn't say much. "About a mile out from Pearson's," he said. "Cobb's the one to watch. If Cobb's satisfied this winter, the other ranchers will follow." "I know," Marin said. "You all right?" She was looking at the road ahead. Her hands were in her lap, not quite steady, though she'd stopped noticing that an hour ago. "I'm fine. You're shaking. I'm cold. The blanket in the wagon bed is yours." "I know whose blanket it is." She reached back and pulled it forward without looking at him and wrapped it around her shoulders. They drove another half-mile. "Harlan's going to make this harder," Wade said. "I know that too. He's got more resources than you. More connections. He can undercut you on price for longer than you can hold out. Then I'd better be better than him in ways he can't undercut." She was looking at the road again, at the flat gray sky above the hills, at the frozen ground on either side. "He can sell cheaper. He can't sell better. Not with the materials he uses. That's the only real advantage I have, and I need to protect it." "How?" "By making sure every person who buys a blanket from me tells the next person about it. By making sure nobody who buys from me has a reason to complain." She pulled the blanket tighter. "By being there this winter when animals are cold, and Harlan's next shipment is still on a train somewhere." Wade drove for a while. "Then my father knew you'd do this." She turned her head slightly. "Not this exactly," he said. "This. Whatever it is you do when someone tells you no." He paused, trying to find the right words, and not quite finding them. "He wrote in that letter that you had more grit than anyone he'd ever met. I thought I didn't know him to say things like that about anyone." Marin was quiet. "I'm starting to think," Wade said slowly, "that there were a lot of things about him I didn't know." "He was a private man," Marin said. "He didn't like being seen being kind. I think it embarrassed him somehow, like it was a weakness." She looked at her hands. "I told him once that it wasn't." He didn't answer. But the next week, he came by with a length of good canvas I'd been trying to save for. A pause. That was his answer, I suppose. Wade drove. The wagon wheels ground over frozen ruts. Somewhere overhead, two crows crossed the gray sky, complaining to each other about something. He talked about you, Marin said. Wade's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Not often, and not warmly exactly. But I don't think he knew how to do warmly. She was choosing her words carefully now, feeling her way through something she'd thought about more than once. He'd say things like, Wade would have spotted that problem faster than me, or my son doesn't waste motion when he works. Like he was thinking out loud about you. Proud, but not able to say it directly, Wade said nothing. I thought you should know, she said, in case you didn't. The wagon went on for a long time after that without any talking, and neither of them tried to fill the silence, because some silences do their own work when you let them. Clara was at the bunkhouse when they got back, along with Dora Payne, who'd shown up that morning uninvited and started organizing the wool stock without being asked. Marin told them about the morning's orders. Clara made a sound that was relief and exhaustion combined. Dora Payne sat down heavily on the bench nearest the stove and said, 24 blankets in 10 days. All right, I'll need a better chair. I'll get you a better chair, Wade said from the doorway. Dora looked at him. She was not a woman who accepted things from people without inspecting the terms. What kind of better chair? The kind with a back that doesn't slant, he said. So your spine doesn't give out before February. Dora looked at Marin. Marin shrugged. Dora looked back at Wade. Fine, she said, with the manner of someone granting a significant concession. He brought the chair the next morning. It was a good one, solid, with a straight back and arms, clearly pulled from the main house rather than purchased. Dora sat in it and said nothing whatsoever and started cutting canvas, which was high praise from Dora Payne. The orders from that first morning at Pearson's were 24 blankets. By Thursday, they were 31. Word had moved, the way word always moved in a spread-out territory slowly at first, then in a rush, neighbor telling neighbor, a comment made at the feed store, a question asked at the blacksmith's. Marin found herself taking orders from men she'd never met, ranchers who lived 2 hours' ride away and had sent word through intermediaries. Harlan responded on Thursday afternoon. He sent his store manager, a tired-looking man named Pruitt, out to Hollowell Ranch with a message. Harlan was prepared to reduce his prices significantly on winter livestock goods, and he wanted local ranchers to know they should hold their orders until his shipment arrived. Marin heard this from Clara, who'd heard it from two separate people. She sat with it that evening. After Clara and Dora had gone, the bunkhouse quiet except for the stove and the wind coming under the door. She was finishing a seam on a blanket for the Pearson order, her hands moving by habit now, the machine's rhythm something she barely noticed anymore. Thought about what Harlan was doing and why, and what she could and couldn't do about it. What she couldn't do was undercut his prices, not sustainably. She'd figured her costs carefully, and the margin she was operating on was already thin enough that if she dropped her price significantly, she'd be working for less than nothing. What she could do was deliver. She could deliver on time, in full, and she could make sure every blanket that left the bunkhouse was the best version of what she knew how to make. She couldn't control what Harlan told people. She couldn't stop him from cutting prices to drive her out. What she could control was the work, and the work would have to speak for itself. It was the same thing she'd been telling herself for 2 years, and it hadn't gotten her very far. But it was the only thing she had. The trouble with Harlan didn't stay in the realm of business competition for long. By the second week of November, 2 things had happened. The first was that Marin had delivered the Pearson order on time, in full, and Pearson had inspected every blanket himself and said, with the economy of a man who never wasted words, good work. Which, from Ed Pearson, was essentially a public endorsement. The second thing was that Harlan Voss had started talking. Not about the blankets. About Marin. It started subtly questions posed in a certain tone at the trading post, comments made to men whose wives then mentioned them to other women, small targeted suggestions dropped into conversations like seeds. Who was Marin Belrose exactly? Where was she from? Did anyone know her family? Was it normal, a woman like that, living and working on a man's property without a clear arrangement? What kind of arrangement might it be? Clara brought this to Marin on a Thursday. Marin listened to all of it without interrupting. When Clara finished, Marin set down the canvas she'd been holding and was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to make people ask questions I can't answer cleanly," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "That's what he's doing, 'cause he can't beat me on the work." Clara looked at her steadily. "Marin, in this territory, a woman's reputation is easier to damage than a man's blanket seam. And it doesn't always matter if the damage is based on anything real." "I know that. Do you?" Marin met her eyes. "Yes. I've known that since I was 16 years old, and an employer I'd never even spoken to told me I wasn't what he was looking for, because someone else had told him something about me that wasn't true." Her voice was flat, informational. "I know exactly what he's doing. I've had it done to me before." She picked up the canvas again. "What I'm asking is how wide has it spread?" "Wide enough," Clara said. "Wade needs to know. I'll tell him." "Tonight," Clara said. "Not next week." "Tonight?" Marin agreed. She told him that evening, in the main house kitchen, with the directness she'd learned was the only way to tell difficult things without having them mutate in the telling. She laid it out plainly what Harlan was saying, what the probable effect would be, what she thought could and couldn't be done about it. Wade listened without interrupting. When she finished, his jaw was set in a way she recognized by now, not anger exactly, or not only anger. The particular expression of a man confronting something he already halfway knew was coming, and is angry at himself for not having moved on sooner. "I should have anticipated this," he said. "It wasn't predictable," Marin said. "He has no actual complaint against you. This is what men like Harlan do when they run out of legitimate complaints. It is predictable. It's what he did to Orson when Orson was." He stopped. Marin looked at him. Wade rubbed the back of his neck. He looked like he'd said more than he meant to. 2 years ago, he said more carefully. "Harlan and my father had a disagreement about land. Harlan wanted access to the water on the east property line for a commercial venture he was building. Orson said no. Harlan started suggesting that Orson was losing his faculties." He paused. "Not directly. Never directly. Just questions. Concerns. Made sure the right people were wondering. Did it work? Enough to be a nuisance." Wade's voice was quiet and tight. Long enough to cost Orson a business deal he'd worked a year to close, because the other party got nervous. He looked at her. Harlan stopped when Orson made clear he had documentation of the original land dispute that Harlan didn't want surfaced. Marin absorbed this. So he responds to the threat of accountability. He responds to consequences. Actual ones, not just moral arguments. Wade's mouth was a thin line, which is a useful thing to know, but it doesn't tell me what consequence we can actually produce right now. "The ranchers," Marin said. He looked at her. "The ranchers who've ordered from me. Cobb, Pearson, the Hennessy brothers. If this winter proves out, if the blankets do what I say they'll do, their testimony is worth more than anything Harlan can manufacture." She met Wade's eyes. "The best answer to what he's saying about me is to be undeniably good at what I do, long enough and visibly enough that his version stops being interesting. That takes time, yes. And between now and then?" Marin looked at her hands. "Between now and then," she said, "we make sure that anything he says about me can be answered with facts. That my work is documented. That my orders are recorded and my dealings are clean, and every person who works with me can speak to what they know directly." She paused. "If he says I'm unreliable, I deliver on time. If he says my quality varies, every product leaves here inspected. If he says my business arrangements are unclear." She hesitated. Wade said, "We formalize them." "Yes." She looked at him. "I'd like a written agreement for the bunkhouse. A lease, properly recorded. Payment schedule, amounts, conditions, all of it on paper." He nodded slowly. "I'll have it written up this week." "I know it protects you too," she said. "I'm not asking as a favor." "I know you're not." He was quiet for a moment. "Marin, what he's saying about us, I know what he's saying." "It's not, I know what it is and what it isn't," she said, firmly but not unkindly. "And so does anyone who's actually watched us work. That won't stop some people from believing it, but those people were never going to be on my side regardless." She stood up. "The ones who matter are the ones watching the work. So we keep working." Wade looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman he'd known 6 weeks, who'd turned an empty bunkhouse into a producing workshop, who'd stood Pearson's yard in her patched coat and talked about seeming to men twice her size, who was now sitting in his kitchen calmly mapping out strategy against a man who'd been making life difficult for people in this county for 20 years. He didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't have words for it yet, and he had the instinct to understand that saying it wrong would be worse than not saying it. He said, "I'll have the lease ready by Friday." She said, "Thank you." She went back to the bunkhouse. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after she'd gone, in the quiet of the house, listening to the wind outside and thinking about his father, who had been private about his kindnesses and bad at warmth, and had nonetheless seen something in this woman clearly enough to spend the last months of his life quietly building something for her. Wade was starting to think he understood. He wasn't entirely sure that was comfortable. He put out the lamp and went to bed, and the wind came through the gaps in the walls, the way it always did in November, and the house was cold in the way that only old houses get cold thoroughly, in the bones of the thing, and Wade lay in the dark and thought about Harlan Voss and written agreements, and the particular way Maren Belrose had said, "I know what it is and what it isn't," with the complete and unhurried certainty of someone who has learned that lesson in a place that cost her something real. He thought about that for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the dark grass, and the temperature dropped another 6 degrees. And in the bunkhouse across the yard, a lamp was still burning Maren, back at the machine, finishing the last seam of the Cobb order that wasn't due for 4 more days, but that she intended to deliver early. She had learned a long time ago that early was its own argument. She worked until the lamp oil ran low, and her hands told her they'd done enough for 1 day. And then she cleaned the machine, covered the finished blankets, banked the stove, and walked back across the frozen yard to the small room Wade had arranged for her in the east corner of the main house when the nights got too cold for the bunkhouse. Past his window. The lamp was out. She went to bed, and for the first time in several weeks, she did not lie awake for 2 hours first. She was asleep in 10 minutes. Across town, in the comfortable back room of his well-stocked store, Harlan Voss was awake and thinking, and not thinking about blankets. He was thinking about the way Pearson had looked at him in that yard. He was thinking about Cobb. He was thinking about a woman in a patched coat who had stood in front of 15 men and not flinched once, and about how that was either the beginning of a serious problem or something he could still manage, and about which one it was going to turn out to be. Poured himself a drink. He wasn't sure yet, but he was sure of one thing. He had underestimated Maren Belrose once, and he wasn't going to make that mistake again. Harlan's price reduction hit on a Monday. Maren heard about it the same way she heard about most things through Clara, who'd been at Culver's trading post buying thread when Pruitt put up the hand-lettered notice in the window. Harlan was offering his livestock blankets at nearly a third below his previous price, good through the end of December, and the notice was careful to mention that his goods came from an established manufacturer with a 20-year track record of reliable supply. It didn't mention Maren by name. It didn't have to. She was in the middle of stitching a reinforced corner on a Hennessy order when Clara came through the bunkhouse door, with that particular expression she wore when the news was bad, and she'd spent the walk over deciding how to say it. Maren looked up, read the expression, and said, "How much?" Clara told her. Maren looked back at her work. Her hands kept moving. "Can he sustain that price long term? I don't know his margins." "I do." Maren had spent an evening 2 weeks earlier with a piece of paper and what she knew about bulk manufacturing costs, freight from the east, Harlan's store overhead. She hadn't liked what the numbers suggested, but she'd done it anyway because knowing an uncomfortable thing was better than not knowing it. He can sustain it through December without much pain. January, he starts feeling it. By February, he either raises prices or he's selling at a loss. 3 months. Yes. Maren tied off the thread, bit it clean. 3 months of customers choosing his price over my quality, unless his quality fails visibly enough this winter to make the argument for me. She set the blanket aside, which is exactly the argument I've been making, and which requires the winter to actually be hard enough to test the difference. Clara sat down on the cutting bench. "Maren, some of the ranchers who hadn't ordered yet 2 of them have told me they're going to wait and see. Take the lower price for now." "Who?" "Merritt and the Dunbar brothers." Maren nodded slowly. Merritt ran a mid-sized operation and was careful with money in the way that men who'd built something from nothing tended to be not cheap, but deliberate. The Dunbar brothers were younger, newer to ranching, operating on thin margins. Harlan's lower price made sense for both of them, and she couldn't honestly say she'd decide differently in their position. "All right," she said. "That's it? All right? What else is there?" Marin stood up, moved to the next piece on the table. "Can't match his price. I won't pretend I can, and I won't promise something I can't deliver. If they choose his product, that's their right." She picked up her scissors. "What I can control is that when his product fails, and Clara, it will fail, because I've felt his seaming, and I've seen what his canvas does after 6 weeks of wet cold when it fails. I'm still here. With a full order book and more than I can manage, maybe, but here." Clara watched her. "You're less upset than I expected." "I'm plenty upset," Marin said without looking up. "I'm just not letting it slow my hands down," I told Wade that evening. He took it the way he took most things, sitting with it, quiet, working through it in his head before he responded. They were at the kitchen table, which had become a kind of habit neither of them had exactly decided on. Marin would finish at the bunkhouse and come in for the evening, and Wade would have coffee on, and they'd sit and talk through whatever needed talking through, and then she'd go to her room, and he'd see to the house, and the night would end. It was practical. Neither of them examined it more closely than that. "He's trying to starve you out before you get established," Wade said. "Yes. And if you get established enough before December ends, his price cut becomes meaningless." "Yes." Marin wrapped both hands around her cup. "Which means I need more orders than I can fill, not fewer. If I go into January with a full order book and a waiting list, it doesn't matter what he charges, ranchers will know I can't take new orders, which means the ones who chose his product are stuck with it through the rest of winter. And if it fails, they'll remember," Wade said. "They'll remember," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then Cobb, she looked at him. "Cobb is the key," Wade said. "He runs the biggest operation in the county. If he increases his order publicly, in a way that gets mentioned around it, changes the conversation. People follow Cobb because they trust his judgment. He ordered 10 blankets. He hasn't said anything about more." "No, but his winter stock isn't fully covered yet. He mentioned it to me last week when I ran into him at the Pearson fence line." Wade turned his cup in a slow circle on the table. "He's watching. He should watch," Marinson said. "His first order should come in next week. He can look at them when they arrive. He'll do more than look. Cobb tests everything." "Good," she said it firmly. "I want him to test them. I want him to pull at the seams and leave them out overnight and drag them through mud if that's what it takes. The work will hold." Wade looked at her across the table. There was something in her voice when she talked about the work, not arrogance, not performance. Just the particular certainty of someone who knows a thing all the way down to the bottom of it. He'd met very few people who had that about anything. "How are Clara and Dora holding up?" he asked. "Clara's blistered hand is healed. She's fast now, faster than she thinks she is. Dora's knee is a problem. She won't say so, but I can see how she moves at the end of the day." Marin paused. "I want to bring in another woman." "Who?" "There's a widow named Ruth Gable. Lives about a mile past the Marsh Creek Bridge. She did sewing work for the Army supplier 2 seasons ago before they switched contractors. I've seen her work. She's good." Marin set down her cup. "She's been washing laundry for the hotel at a rate that's embarrassing. I think she'd come if I asked." "What can you pay her?" "Not much yet, but more than laundry wages, and with a place at the table." She looked at him. "Is that all right? One more person in the bunkhouse?" "You run the bunkhouse, Marin. It's your property." "Under a lease," he said. "Which you pay, which means it's your space to manage." He met her eyes steadily. "Bring Ruth Gable. If she's as good as you say, you need her." Marin nodded. She looked down at her cup. There was something she wanted to say and wasn't sure how to say it, and she sat with it for a moment, testing different approaches. "Your father's letter," she said finally. "The part you didn't read to me." Wade was still. "You read the whole thing twice at this table," she said, "and then you told me some of what it said. But not all." She kept her voice even. "I'm not asking because I have a right to know everything in a letter addressed to me." I'm asking because I think there's something in it that's been sitting between us. Wade turned his cup once more on the table. He looked at his hands. He said, he asked me to be honest with you. She waited. He wrote Wade stopped. Started again. He wrote that he'd watched you work for 2 winters, and that he'd never seen anyone with more capability be shown less opportunity. And he wrote that some of that was the town, and some of it was Harlan, and some of it, he paused again. He said some of it was the kind of pride that sometimes keeps people from asking for what they need. Marin was very still. He wrote that you'd probably try to do this all yourself, Wade said, without asking for anything, and that if I let you do that, I was failing you the same way the town already had. He looked up. He was pretty direct about it, actually. More direct than he ever was with me about anything, which I'll admit stung a little to read. What did he say exactly? Her voice was quiet. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then, with the air of someone deciding to do a thing they've been putting off, he said, Wade, this woman is going to tell you she doesn't need anything. She's been saying that so long she's started to believe it herself. Don't accept it. Find out what she actually needs and make it possible. That's all. Don't fix anything for her. Don't manage anything for her. Just make it possible. He met her eyes. That's what he wrote. Marin looked at the table. Something moved across her face, not tears exactly, but the precursor to them, the particular tightening around the eyes that happened before a person decided whether they were going to let themselves feel a thing or not. She made her decision in about 3 seconds, which was faster than most people. Her face settled. He was right, she said. About the pride part. I figured. I've been saying I don't need anything for so long that sometimes I forget what it felt like to need something, and have it be all right to say so. She looked up. I'm still learning that. So am I, Wade said. Different version of the same problem. She looked at him. He looked back at her. It was a different kind of looking than either of them had done before, more direct, less careful, the kind that happens when 2 people stop managing each other and just see what's actually there. Then Marin cleared her throat and stood up and said she needed to be up early to start the Cobb order, and Wade said he needed to check on the east fence, and they both retreated into the practical, which was where both of them were most comfortable. And the moment folded itself away into the evening without fanfare. But it had happened. They both knew it had happened. Cobb's blankets arrived on a Wednesday ahead of schedule. Marin delivered them herself, in Wade's wagon, on a morning cold enough that her breath came out short visible clouds, and the horses moved reluctantly over the frozen ground. She brought all 10, folded and stacked in order, each one with a small piece of paper pinned to the corner, noting the measurements and the canvas grade. Cobb met her at the barn. He was a compact man of about 55, with a short gray beard and eyes that missed very little. He didn't greet her warmly. He didn't greet anybody warmly, Clara had said. It wasn't personal, but he nodded at the stack of blankets and said, "Let's have a look." He spent 40 minutes with them. He checked every seam. He pulled at corners the way the Pearson Ranch hand had pulled at them, harder, using his full weight. He turned blankets inside out to check the batting distribution. He took one outside and spread it on the frozen ground, and poured a bucket of water over it, and waited to see how the canvas handled the cold and wet together, which was a test Marin had not expected, but which the blanket handled without complaint. He brought 2 of his ranch hands over, and had them inspect specific stitching he pointed to, without telling them what he was looking for, watching their faces while they felt the work. Marin stood at the barn door through all of it. She didn't explain anything else. She'd said what needed saying when she delivered. The work was either speaking for itself or it wasn't. After 40 minutes, Cobb came back to her. 4 of these, he said, have a slightly irregular batting distribution in the upper left quadrant. Minor, won't affect function, but it's there. Marin had spotted the same thing herself during final inspection and had noted it in her own records. She didn't say that. Instead, she said, "You're right. I'll adjust the distribution process." He looked at her. "You knew." "Yes. Why deliver them if you knew?" "Because the regularity is minor and functional, as you said, and because I'd rather deliver on schedule with a minor noted imperfection than be late chasing perfection." She paused. "But I'm glad you checked. It's the kind of thing I need someone to tell me." Cobb studied her for a long moment. The kind of studying that meant something. I'm going to add 6 to my order, he said, and I'm going to tell the Hennessy brothers what I found and what I told you and what you said. They'll draw their own conclusions. It wasn't praise. It wasn't even quite approval. It was something more useful than either. It was the considered judgment of a man whose considered judgment meant something in this county, and Marin received it the way it was offered, without performing gratitude. Thank you, she said. Your pricing, Cobb said. I want to understand your thinking. My price reflects the materials and the labor at a margin that lets me pay my workers fairly and reinvest in the operation. It's not inflated. She met his eyes. It's also not going to drop to match Harlan's December special, because his December price is below cost and he'll raise it in January. I'd rather you know what to expect from me and plan accordingly. Cobb was quiet for a moment. Harlan's been in this territory longer than you've been alive. Yes, he's got relationships here, credit lines, storage, distribution. Yes, she didn't look away from him. What he doesn't have is a product that holds through a Wyoming February. Which you know, Mr. Cobb, because you talked to Pearson. Something shifted in Cobb's expression. Not warmth, he didn't seem to do warmth, but something that might, in a different man, have been a smile. I'll send word about the additional 6, he said. He turned and went back into his barn. Marin walked back to the wagon. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she was cold clear through, and she'd been holding herself very still for 40 minutes, which was exhausting in a way that didn't show from the outside. Climbed up to the wagon seat. She picked up the reins. She let out a long, controlled breath. Then she drove home. Ruth Gable came on a Friday morning, which was the same Friday that Harlan Voss made his first direct move. Ruth arrived first. She was a tall woman, gaunt in the way that people got when they'd been working hard and eating insufficiently for too long, with large, capable hands and a precision about her movements that Marin recognized immediately the unconscious economy of someone who'd learned to work in small spaces and make every motion count. She stood in the bunkhouse doorway and looked at the machines and the work tables, and Dora Payne in her straight-backed chair, and Clara sorting canvas on the cutting table, and she said, I can start today, if that works. It works, Marin said. Come in and I'll show you the pattern. Ruth came in. Within 2 hours, she'd mastered the primary seaming pattern and was moving at a pace that made Clara look up twice with something like respectful alarm. By the end of the day, she'd completed more work than Marin had projected for 2 days. During the noon meal bread and salt pork that Marin cooked on the bunkhouse stove, nothing elaborate. Nobody expected elaborate. Ruth Gable sat at the work table with her food and said, without looking up, why is the canvas doubled at the lower third? Livestock tend to kick the lower section when they're cold and uncomfortable, Marin said. The doubling adds about 20% to the material cost, but extends the usable life of the blanket by a full season, minimum. Ranchers replace less often. Over 3 years, they spend less than they would on single-layer blankets, even at my higher price per unit. Ruth considered this. She ate. She said, that's the argument to make to the ones who complain about price. Yes. Marin looked at her. I've been making it. Some hear it, some don't. Men hear math, Ruth said flatly, from the particular experience of a woman who had dealt extensively with men. Show them the 3-year cost, not the per-unit cost. They'll argue less. Clara said from across the room, she's right. I know she's right. Marin said, and made a mental note to put the 3-year calculation on paper she could hand to customers, which was something she should have done 6 weeks ago. That was noon. At 2 o'clock, Pruitt came. He knocked on the bunkhouse door frame. The door was open. It was a working space and stood there with the air of a man who would rather be anywhere else and is doing a job because the alternative is worse. He was holding an envelope. Miss Belrose. He held out the envelope. Mr. Voss asked me to deliver this. Marin took it. Looked at it. Didn't open it. What does it say? Pruitt shifted his weight. He doesn't share the contents of his correspondence with me. Pruitt. Her voice was level. You've been working for Harlan Voss for 8 years. He doesn't send you somewhere without telling you what you're carrying. Pruitt's jaw moved. Clara had stopped sorting canvas. Ruth Gable had not stopped sewing, but the pace had slowed. He's claiming, Pruitt said carefully, That the bunkhouse space you're operating in was subject to a prior arrangement between himself and the late Mr. Hollowell. A right of first use, he's calling it. He says the arrangement was verbal but documented in his records, and that he intends to have it examined by the county recorder's office. Nobody moved. Marin looked at the envelope in her hand. A right of first use, she said. That's what he's saying. For what purpose? Storage. For his supply operation. Pruitt was looking somewhere to the left of her face. He says he was planning to establish a satellite supply point on the east edge of the territory, and that Orson had agreed to the use of the bunkhouse for that purpose. Marin set the envelope on the nearest table, unopened. She said, "Thank you, Pruitt. Tell Mr. Voss I'll read his letter." Pruitt nodded and left, with the visible relief of someone who has delivered bad news and survived it. Nobody in the bunkhouse said anything for about 10 seconds. Then Ruth Gable said, without stopping her sewing, "Is there documentation?" "If there were real documentation, he'd have led with it, instead of sending a letter," Clara said. "He's manufacturing a claim," Marin said. She was still looking at the envelope. Verbal arrangement, documented in his own records. Which means he writes down what he wants his records to say and then presents it as evidence. She picked up the envelope. "He's done this before. Wade told me about the land dispute with Orson." "What do you need?" Ruth asked. The question was completely practical, not emotional, not panic, just what is the next thing? "Wade needs to know about this today," Marin said. "And I need to know what Orson actually had in writing about this property." Wade's reaction was not what she expected. She'd expected anger. He had it, she could see it in the set of his shoulders when she showed him the letter, which she'd opened and read, and which said exactly what Pruitt had described, in the careful language of someone who'd had legal documents written up before. But beneath the anger was something else, something that looked like recognition. "He tried this with Orson," Wade said. "The land dispute I told you about. You said Orson had documentation that shut it down." "He did. Papers from the original survey, correspondence with the county recorder." Wade folded the letter. He was meticulous about documentation, because he'd been cheated once before he learned to be. He looked at her. "I have his papers, everything he kept. Then we need to go through them tonight." "Yes." He stood up. "The bunkhouse, is it in the lease?" "The lease is filed with the county recorder. I filed it the day after you wrote it up." She'd done that herself, the morning after the conversation about Orson's letter, riding into town early before work. She'd said nothing about it to Wade at the time because it had seemed unnecessary to report. Now she watched his expression change as he absorbed this. "You filed it immediately." "I file everything immediately," she said. "I've learned that lesson." He looked at her steadily. "Harlan doesn't know it's recorded. He's about to find out." Wade went to the storage chest where he kept his father's papers and began going through them, and Marin sat at the kitchen table and helped him sort. It was past midnight before they found what they were looking for, or rather, before they established clearly what was not there. No agreement, verbal or otherwise, about the bunkhouse. No correspondence with Harlan about any storage arrangement. What they did find was a letter from Orson to the county recorder from 14 months ago, formally noting that the Hollowell East bunkhouse was designated for private ranch use and was not available for commercial lease or access by third parties. Orson had written that letter 14 months ago. 4 months before, he hired someone to hold a sewing machine in Culver's back room. Marin sat at the table and read the letter twice and thought about the timeline, about a man who had known he was sick and had spent months quietly closing doors, so that a specific door would remain open when the time came. He knew, she said. Wade was very still across the table. He knew Harlan would try something when a woman started operating out of this property. She set the letter down carefully. Closed this avenue 14 months ago, before he even had the sewing machine. Before you knew any of this was happening. Wade said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the letter in a way that suggested he was not really seeing it. "He didn't just want me to help you," Wade said finally. His voice was quiet. He'd already built the defenses. He just needed someone to actually be here to use them. Kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. The fire in the stove had burned low, and neither of them moved to rebuild it. "What do we do with this?" Marin asked. To tomorrow morning, Wade said. We take it to the county recorder's office. The recorded lease, my father's letter, and a written account of this claim Harlan is making. He looked at her. And then we let the county recorder do his job. Harlan has relationships with people at the county office. He has relationships with everyone. That doesn't mean he has the right to manufacture claims against property that's already on the public record. Wade folded the letter with careful hands. He's betting you don't have documentation. He does that because it works. Usually, Marin agreed. Not this time. Wade set the letter on the table between them. He looked up. You all right? She thought about it honestly. I'm angry, she said, and I'm tired. And if I'm completely honest, part of me wants to walk into Harlan's store tomorrow morning and say several things I can't unsay. She paused. But I'm not going to do that. No, Wade agreed. Because it would feel good for about 30 seconds, and then it would hand him exactly the version of me he wants people to see. She straightened in her chair. So instead, I'm going to the county recorder's office with a stack of legal documents, and I'm going to be very calm and very clear, and I'm going to let the paper do the talking. Wade looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had the same quality she'd noticed at the kitchen table a week ago, the more direct look, the one that wasn't managed. He said, My father was right about you. Marin felt that land somewhere she didn't entirely expect it to. She looked at the table. Get some sleep, she said. We need to leave early. She went to her room. She did not fall asleep in 10 minutes this time. She lay in the dark and thought about Harlan and the county recorder and Orson's letter and the 3-year cost calculation she needed to put on paper and Ruth Gable's hands moving over the seaming without stopping even. When Pruitt had come to the door with his bad news, she thought about Wade saying, My father was right about you, in that quiet voice. She thought about that for longer than she intended. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, and somewhere across the territory, the first serious snow of the season was building itself out of a sky that had been threatening for a week. And in barns and enclosures all across the county, livestock were shifting in the cold, and some of them were wearing blankets that would hold through February. And some of them were wearing blankets with seams that were going to start giving way in the next hard freeze. By morning, the snow had begun. Marin was already awake when it started. She heard it change the quality of the silence outside her window, that particular muffling that snowfall brought, and she got up and looked at the gray-white sky and the first thin layer on the frozen ground. And she felt the cold coming through the window glass against her palm. Thought, good. Not because she wished anyone harm. Not because she wanted to see animals suffer. But because a hard winter was the only honest test, and she had done the work. And the work was either enough or it wasn't. And now they were all going to find out. She dressed. She went to the kitchen and put the coffee on before Wade was up, which was the first time she'd done that. And she stood at the window while the coffee heated and watched the snow come down and thought about Orson Hollowell writing a letter to a county recorder 14 months ago, alone in this kitchen, closing a door against a man who hadn't even made his move yet, planning for a woman he barely knew, planning for a future he wouldn't see. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window and held it there, and outside the snow kept coming. Steady and quiet and entirely indifferent to everyone's plans, covering everything in the same white, the way weather always did, not knowing or caring who'd built well and who'd built cheap, but making the difference visible all the same. The county recorder's office smelled like old paper and coal smoke, and the man behind the desk, a thin, careful person named Aldous Webb, who wore the same gray vest every day of his working life, looked at the documents Marin and Wade laid in front of him with the slow, thorough attention of someone who understood that his job existed precisely for moments like this one. He read Orson's letter first, then the recorded lease, then Harlan's claim, which Marin had brought in its original envelope. He read all three twice in the same order without comment. Then he set them side by side on his desk and folded his hands on top of them and looked at Wade. The lease was recorded November 4th, he said. Yes, Wade said. Mr. Voss's claim is dated November 9th. Yes. Webb looked at the claim again. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he already understands but wants to be careful about. Mr. Voss is asserting a prior verbal arrangement. Documented, he says, in his own records. That's what his letter states, Marin said. And the late Mr. Hollowell's letter, Webb touched Orson's document, designating the property for private ranch use, was filed 14 months ago. Yes. Webb was quiet for a moment. The coal stove in the corner of his office ticked and settled. Outside, the snow was coming down steadily, the second day of it, and the window behind Webb's desk showed a street that was mostly white and mostly empty. Miss Belrose, Webb said. Mr. Hollowell. He picked up Harlan's claim and held it for a moment. Not dramatically, just the gesture of a man deciding how to say a thing he's already decided. This claim has no standing against a recorded instrument. A verbal arrangement, regardless of how it's documented in a private party's records, cannot supersede a legal filing with this office. He set the claim down. I'll send Mr. Voss a formal notice to that effect today. Marin let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 18 hours. Is there anything else he can do? Wade asked. Legally. He could file a challenge. He'd need actual documentation, a signed agreement, a witness, something with legal weight. A letter he wrote himself in his own ledger isn't going to move a territorial court. Webb paused. I'll be candid with you. I've seen Mr. Voss make this kind of claim before. He tends to do it when he believes the other party doesn't have their paperwork in order. When they do, he tends to withdraw. Marin looked at the man across his desk. You've seen him do this before, she said. To whom? Webb met her eyes. Something in his expression shifted, not quite discomfort, but the particular careful look of a public official who knows more than his position allows him to say freely. I'm not in a position to speak to other parties' business, he said. But I will tell you that your documentation is thorough, and your position is clear, and that's what matters here. They left his office with the snow coming down around them and the street muffled quiet. Wade said, he's seen Harlan do this before. To at least one other person who didn't have their paperwork in order, Marin said. And that person presumably lost. Yes, Wade's jaw was set. We should find out who. We will, Marin said. But not today. Today I need to get back to the bunkhouse. Ruth had a question yesterday about the saddlebag pattern I didn't finish answering, and Clara's been managing the Dunbar inquiry on her own, and she shouldn't have to. Wade looked at her sideways. The Dunbar brothers came back? Sent word yesterday. Apparently their first order from Harlan's December special arrived, and one of the blankets was already separating at the lower seam. She said it without satisfaction. Just fact. Clara told me this morning. They want to know if I can fit them into the current order rotation. Wade stopped walking. You knew this yesterday and didn't say anything? I was focused on the county recorder. She kept walking. I'm saying it now. He caught up to her. They walked through the snow in silence for half a block. Then Wade said, how many orders can you actually handle right now? More than I have women to fill them, she said. Which is the real problem. Then hire another woman. With what? I'm paying Clara, Dora, and Ruth fairly, which leaves me a margin that's functional but not flexible. She turned up her collar against the cold. I need the cob payment to clear before I can add another wage. When does it clear? End of the week. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to bridge it. I know you're not. I mean it, Wade. I know you mean it. He looked straight ahead at the white street. And I'm not offering to. I'm asking a logistical question. She accepted this. End of the week. Then you hire someone the following Monday. The right person is available. Who do you have in mind? She hesitated. There's a woman named Agnes Polk. She's been living with her daughter on the Marsh Creek Road since her husband died last spring. She did all the leather work for her husband's harness operation before he got sick tooling, stitching, the technical work. The daughter's husband doesn't have enough for another mouth comfortably, but Agnes is too proud to say so directly. Marin paused. She's 53. Her hands are still good. You've been watching her for a while. I've been watching a lot of women for a while. There was no apology in it. Because I know what it looks like when someone has capability and nowhere to put it. Wade was quiet. The snow came down around them, fine and steady, and the horses at the hitching post outside the feed store stood with their heads down and their backs white with it. Talk to Agnes Polk on Monday, he said. Don't wait for the cob payment. Wade, the cob payment will clear. If it doesn't, I'll sort it. Not as charity as a business loan with terms written down, same as everything else. He stopped and looked at her directly. You need Agnes Polk starting Monday because the Dunbar brothers just came back, and Harlan's shipment is going to fail in at least 3 more places before February ends. When it does, you need to be able to say yes immediately. You can't say yes if you're already at capacity. Marin looked at him standing in the snow in his working coat, his hat white on the brim, saying things that were completely practical and entirely correct. She said, all right, he agreed, and they walked back to the wagon. Agnes Polk came on a Monday. She was a compact woman who moved efficiently and spoke rarely and had the leatherworker's particular relationship with her tools intimate, proprietary, the way musicians handled instruments. Within her first hour, she'd reorganized the leather supply corner of the bunkhouse without asking permission, in a way that was objectively more logical than what had been there before, and nobody objected because it was obviously right. She looked at Marin's current saddlebag design, studied it for a full 5 minutes without speaking, and then said, the gusset stitching here, if you angle it 15 degrees, you increase the load capacity by 1/3 without adding material cost. Marin looked at the spot she indicated. She saw immediately that Agnes was right. Show me, Marin said. Agnes showed her. By the end of the first week, Agnes had revised 3 patterns in small but significant ways, each change improving function without increasing cost. And Marin had accepted every revision because they were better, and there was no pride worth holding on to that was more important than a better product. Clara watched this happen with the expression of someone reassessing something. On Thursday, she said quietly, to Marin, where did you find her? She was always here, Marin said. Nobody was looking. December moved the way Wyoming Decembers moved, aggressively and without apology. The snow that started in mid-November did not really stop. It paused sometimes, gave you a day or two of hard, bright cold with no new accumulation, and then came back. Temperature on some mornings was low enough that the water in the bunkhouse wash basin froze overnight, and Marin had to break the ice before she could wash her face. The work continued regardless. Belrose Frontier Goods, the name had been Clara's suggestion, offered carefully one afternoon, and accepted immediately, was producing at a rate that 3 months ago Marin would have called impossible. 4 women working full days, patterns refined to maximum efficiency, materials ordered in larger quantities that reduced per unit cost, delivery schedule maintained with a precision that was becoming, quietly, its own kind of reputation. Orders came from outside the immediate county. A rancher 2 days' ride north had heard about the Cobb order from a neighbor. A woman in the next territory who ran a boarding house wanted canvas covers for her outdoor supply storage. A livery operator wanted a bulk order of horse blankets heavier grade, he specified, for animals that stood outside through the night. The livery order was the largest single order Marin had received. She sat with it for an evening, doing the math, figuring the materials and the time, and what she could realistically promise. Told Wade about it at the kitchen table. He listened to the numbers. He said, can you fill it? In 6 weeks, yes. In 3 weeks, which is what he wants, not if I'm also filling the current rotation. What happens if you tell him 6 weeks? He might take it. He might find another supplier. Is there another supplier who can do the quality he's asking for? Harlan can't. Not with his current goods. She turned her pencil over in her fingers. There's a woman in Casper who does canvas work, but she's primarily tent and wagon cover. She hasn't done livestock blankets. So his real choice is 6 weeks with you or an uncertain alternative. Yes, tell him 6 weeks, Wade said, and explain why. Give him the same math you just gave me. Men don't always want the math when. Give him the math, Wade said again. He's a businessman. He'll respect the honesty more than a promise you'd have to break. She wrote the letter that evening. 6 weeks, full explanation, detailed breakdown of why. She sent it the next morning. The livery operator wrote back in 4 days. 6 weeks was acceptable, and could she quote him a standing quarterly order? She read that letter twice. Then she put it in her file, the file that had started as a small stack held together with a piece of string and had become, over the past 2 months, an organized system of folders in a wooden box that Ruth had built from scrap lumber on a slow afternoon. Then she sat down and thought carefully about what a standing quarterly order meant for her capacity, her materials supply, her labor costs, and the physical limits of the bunkhouse operation. She'd been thinking about the bunkhouse limits for a while. That evening she said to Wade, "I need to talk to you about the space." He looked up from the account book he was working on. "What about it?" "I'm going to outgrow it," she said it plainly. "Not immediately. But by spring, if the order volume continues at this rate, I'll need more room. More machines. Probably one more woman, maybe two." He set down his pencil. "What are you thinking?" "There's the old tack building on the south side of the property. It's larger than the bunkhouse, better light, and it's got a second room that could serve as storage." She met his eyes. "I know it's not empty. You're using part of it. I'm using a quarter of it for equipment that could go in the main barn." He was quiet for a moment. "If I move the equipment, I'm not asking you to." "Marin." He looked at her steadily. "Stop apologizing for needing space to grow." Closed her mouth. "The tack building," he said. "I'll move the equipment by the end of the month. You work out what changes you need. Made the stove, the windows, whatever, and we add it to the lease terms." She looked at him. "The lease terms are already fair. Then they'll stay fair with more square footage." He picked up his pencil. "Talk to Clara about the layout. She has opinions about workspace organization that she hasn't fully expressed yet because she's been polite, and I think she'd enjoy the chance." Marin almost smiled. "You've noticed Clara's opinions." "Clara's opinions are difficult to miss." He went back to his accounts. "Talk to her. The second week of January, Harlan's shipment failed. Not everywhere at once. Not dramatically. It happened the way these things always happened. One rancher mentioned to another that 2 of his blankets had given way at the corner, seeming in the hard freeze, and that rancher mentioned it to a third, and within a week there were 6 separate reported failures across 4 different operations, all involving blankets from Harlan's December special. All at the same structural point that Marin had identified 2 years ago when she'd first examined his goods. The lower seam, the corner attachment. Place where a cheaper manufacturing process saved time and cost and held up fine in moderate cold, and failed systematically in the kind of sustained deep freeze that Wyoming delivered without mercy in January. Harlan's responded the way he always responded, calmly, reasonably, with explanations that were technically not lies. Unusual weather conditions, manufacturing variants. He'd look into it. He'd speak to his supplier. He offered partial credit to affected customers, which was enough to manage some of the anger, but not enough to fix animals that had already had a bad night in the cold. Pearson sent word to Marin directly, not about his own blankets, those were holding. He sent word to say that the Merritt Ranch had lost a mare that had been blanketed with Harlan's December goods, and that Merritt was looking to replace his entire stock and wanted to know Marin's current wait time. Marin wrote back the same day, 3 weeks for a full replacement order. She then told the women in the bunkhouse that they were going to work Saturdays through the end of January, and she told them what she'd pay for the extra time, and she asked if that was acceptable. All 4 said yes. Agnes Polk said yes before Marin finished asking the question. The Merritt order came in 2 days later. Then the Dunbar brothers called in a full order, not just a replacement for the failed blanket, but a complete set, enough for their whole operation. Then a rancher named Flint, who Marin had never met, sent a letter that had clearly been written in a state of cold fury about Harlan Voss's partial credit offer and ended with, "Tell me what you can provide and when, and I'll pay your price without negotiation." Clara read that letter over Marin's shoulder and said, "I think we need another machine." "I know," Marin said. "Where's the money for? I'm working on it." She was working on it by renegotiating her materials costs. She went to Culver directly and laid out what she was projecting for the next 6 months' volume, regularity, payment terms, and asked what he could do on bulk pricing for canvas and wool. Culver was a practical man who understood that a reliable regular customer was worth more than a series of one-off transactions, and they reached an agreement that afternoon that reduced her materials cost by 11%. 11% wasn't a new machine, but it was the beginning of saving toward one, and it changed her monthly margin enough to matter. She wrote the number down in her ledger that night, beside the running total she'd been keeping since October, and she looked at how far the numbers had come and felt the complicated feeling that wasn't quite pride the cautious. Conditional feeling of someone who knows that things can still go wrong and has simply decided to proceed anyway. Harlan came to see her himself in the third week of January. She'd half expected it, though not quite this soon. Came to the bunkhouse on a Tuesday afternoon when the snow was down to a hard crust and the sky was the particular flat gray that meant more was coming. He knocked on the open door frame the same way Pruitt had, which meant the open door wasn't an invitation to Harlan Voss, it was just a door. Marin looked up from the machine. Ruth looked up. Clara looked up. Dora Payne did not look up. Agnes Polk did not look up. Miss Belrose, Harlan said. A word? I'm working, Marin said. I won't take long. She finished the seam she was on, tied it off, checked it. Then she stood up and came to the door. She didn't step outside. She stood in the doorway, which was her space, and looked at him standing in the cold. He looked, she thought, mostly the same, as always well-dressed for the territory. That careful pleasantness held up in front of him like a shield. But something around his eyes was different, tighter. He'd had a difficult January. I wanted to speak with you about your order situation, he said. I've heard you're at capacity. Word gets around. It does. He put his hands in his coat pockets, not a threatening gesture, a casual one. Everything Harlan did in public was calibrated to read as casual. I've been thinking about the market here, supply and demand. You've clearly found a product that works. I've had some difficulties with my last shipment that I'll be addressing with my manufacturer. I heard about your difficulties, Marin said. I'm sorry for the ranchers who had bad winters because of them. His jaw moved briefly. Yes, well, these things happen in any supply operation. He looked past her into the bunkhouse at the women working. What I'm proposing is a conversation about the possibility of carrying your goods in my store. A distribution arrangement. You produce, I sell, we split the margin. Marin was quiet for a moment. That's what you're proposing, she said. You'd have access to my existing customer relationships. My store traffic. You wouldn't need to manage sales directly. He smiled. It frees you to focus on production, and you'd set the retail price. I'd set it competitively, and the split, standard consignment terms. We could negotiate. She looked at him. She thought about standing outside his trading post 2 years ago, in the cold, with a sample blanket under her arm, asking him to look at her work. She thought about what he'd said to her that day. She thought about the 14 months Orson had spent quietly building defenses against a man he'd apparently understood very well. No, she said. He looked at her. The pleasantness held, but it was working harder. I haven't named specific terms yet. I know, the answer is still no. She met his eyes directly. I spent 2 years trying to get you to look at this work. You weren't interested then because it was mine. You're interested now because it's proven, and because your supply failed, and because the ranchers in this county are paying attention in a different way than they were in October. She paused. I don't need your store, Mr. Voss. I have a customer base and a reputation and a waiting list. What you're offering me is your distribution in exchange for the margin I've built. That's not a deal that benefits me. It benefits you by giving you stability. I'll build my own stability, she said, the same way I built everything else. He looked at her for a moment. The pleasantness had gone to something more honest, not anger, exactly, but the stripped-down expression of a man who's run out of social performance and is just looking at a situation clearly. You're going to turn down a partnership with the most established merchant in this territory, he said. 'Cause of pride. I'm going to turn down an arrangement that puts my products in your control and calls it a partnership, she said. Because of math. A beat of silence. You've changed, he said. Came out like something he hadn't meant to say. No, she said, I haven't. She stepped back from the doorway. Have a safe ride back to town. She went back to the machine. Behind her, she heard him stand there a moment. Then his footsteps moved away across the frozen ground. Nobody in the bunkhouse said anything. Ruth had not stopped sewing through any of it. Clara was resolutely sorting canvas. Agnes Polk was doing something precise with a leather gusset that required complete attention. Dora Payne said, without looking up from her work, good. Just the one word, like a period at the end of a sentence. Wade heard about it from Marin that evening, and from 3 other people over the following 2 days, which told him something about how many windows had been open in the bunkhouse that afternoon, and how sound traveled in a Wyoming winter when the wind was down. He didn't say much about the Harlan conversation itself. he said. The county recorder sent the formal notice. I know. Webb's clerk brought a copy to the bunkhouse. Harlan hasn't responded to it. He won't, Marin said. He's moved on. The claim was a test to see if we had our paperwork together. We did. That door is closed. She was cutting bread at the kitchen counter, which was something she'd started doing occasionally when she came in for the evening, and found him not yet finished with supper, moving into the kitchen with the natural ease of someone who's stopped thinking about whether they belong in a space. He came today to try a different door, the distribution offer. Yes, she set the bread on the table. He'll try something else next. I don't know what yet. What do you think it'll be? She sat down across from him. He needs to recapture the ranchers he's lost this winter. He can't do that on quality, so he'll do it on price or on service or on something else I haven't thought of yet. She looked at the table. He's not finished. I want to be clear-eyed about that. I know, Wade said. Some people are treating January like it's a victory. It isn't. It's a better position than October. That's all. That's a lot. It's not the end. She met his eyes. I'm not saying this to be pessimistic. I'm saying it because I've watched what happens when people think they've won and they stop being careful. Wade looked at her. He said carefully, Are you all right? Not the business. You, she considered the question. He'd asked it before, and she'd answered it the same way. Each time, I'm fine. I'm tired. I'm fine. Tonight she sat with it a moment longer. I'm better than I was in October, she said. In October, I was running on determination and not much else. Now I have Clara and Ruth and Agnes and Dora, and I have work that's going somewhere, and I have, she paused. I have this. She gestured vaguely at the kitchen, which wasn't a dramatic gesture, not at the room or the house, just at the table and the bread and the 2 cups of coffee and the fact of the evening, which was ordinary in the way that things become ordinary when they're also, quietly, essential. Wade looked at where she'd gestured. He looked back at her. He said, So do I. It was a simple thing to say. It landed more heavily than simple things usually did. Neither of them immediately looked away. Then Marin picked up her coffee and said, The tack building, when do you think you can move the equipment? And Wade said, End of the week. And they talked about the tack building for a while, and the bread got eaten, and the coffee went cold. And outside the temperature dropped another degree, and the stars came out hard and bright above the frozen land. And in the bunkhouse, 4 machines sat still and waiting for morning. And somewhere in the back of Marin's mind, the quarterly livery order and the merit replacement job and Agnes Polk's gusset revision were all quietly arranging themselves into a plan that kept getting larger. And she was tired in a way she'd stopped minding, and the kitchen was warm, and Wade was across the table, and she thought, this is what it feels like when a thing is working. She held that thought carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure yet how to keep. Outside, the stars burned cold and clear over the Wyoming hills, and the night settled in, around the ranch, the way nights did out here completely, with no apology for its darkness, and no promise about the morning, except that it was coming. That was enough. For tonight, it was enough. February broke Harlan Voss the way hardened winters break things that were already compromised, not all at once, not dramatically, but through accumulated pressure applied to the exact points where the structure was weakest. Started with Merritt. Merritt was not a man who talked much in public, which was precisely why it mattered when he did. He came into Culver's trading post on a Thursday morning in the second week of February, bought what he needed, and on his way out stopped and said to the 4 men standing near the stove, in a conversational tone, that he'd replaced his entire blanket stock with Belrose goods in January and hadn't lost a single animal in the hard freeze that had come through the week prior. He said it the way he'd say anything flatly, as fact without performance. Then he left. By Friday afternoon, Marin had 2 new inquiries. By the following Tuesday, she had 4 more, including one from a rancher named Goss, who operated 2 valleys over and had heard about Merritt from a neighbor who had heard from someone at Culver's. The order network was becoming something she hadn't quite planned for organic, word-driven, expanding outward from a center she hadn't consciously built, but had apparently created through the simple, repeated act of delivering what she said she would deliver, when she said she would deliver it. She told Wade about the Goss inquiry over supper. He said, Is the tack building ready? Agnes and Ruth moved the last of their equipment in on Monday. Then you have the capacity. For now. She turned her fork over in her hand. I've been thinking about the spring. He waited. When the worst of the winter breaks, the urgency for livestock blankets drops. The ranchers who needed them have them. New orders will slow down. She wasn't saying this with worry, she was saying it the way she said most things, as an observed fact that required a response. I need to have the next product ready before that happens. Something that sells in spring and summer. What are you thinking? Canvas covers for grain storage. Water-resistant, reinforced, sized for the standard granary configurations out here. She set her fork down. I've talked to Ruth and Agnes about the pattern work. It's not complicated, it uses the same basic materials and techniques, just different application. The margins are thinner per unit, but the volume potential is significant. Every farm operation in the territory uses some version of grain cover. Wade was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this for a while. Since December. She looked at him. I didn't mention it because in December I wasn't sure we'd make it to February. He looked at her steadily. And now? Now I'm fairly sure we'll make it to spring. She said it without celebration, just calibrated honesty. Which means I need to be thinking about what comes after. He nodded. Talk to Culver about canvas pricing for a larger order. And talk to Cobb. He's got more grain storage than anyone in the county. Cobb says the product is worth buying. The rest will follow. I know. She picked up her fork again. I've already written to Cobb. Wade looked at her. A small expression crossed his face, not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. The look of a man who has stopped being surprised and started being something else. Something he was still finding the right word for. Of course you have, he said. Harlan's final move came on a Friday. Not a legal claim this time. Not a price war. He'd tried both and found the ground too solid under Marin's feet to shift through either. What he tried instead was a letter to 3 of the largest ranching operations in the northern part of the county, Cobb, Pearson, and a man named Aldrich, who ran sheep primarily and was newer to the territory, suggesting that Belrose Frontier Goods was operating at a scale beyond its legal capacity, that the bunkhouse and tack building arrangement on Hollowell Ranch might constitute an unlicensed commercial operation, and that they might want to consider the stability of a supplier who could face regulatory challenge before committing to long-term orders. Cobb brought his letter to Marin directly. He rode out on a Saturday morning, which was unusual enough that when Marin saw him coming up the drive from the bunkhouse window, she told Clara to keep working and went outside to meet him. He handed her the letter without preamble and watched her face while she read it. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it. Is any of it true? Cobb asked, not unkindly with the directness of a man who wanted a straight answer. No, she said. I have a recorded lease on both buildings. I have a territorial business filing. I filed it in December when the order volume made it necessary. Everything is documented and current. She met his eyes. I can show you every piece of paper today if you want to see them. I don't need to see them, Cobb said. I needed to hear you say it plainly. She looked at him. Then why did you bring the letter to me instead of just ignoring it? Because you should know he sent it. Cobb took the letter back and put it in his coat pocket. And because I'm going to write back to him and tell him that his concerns have been reviewed and found to be without merit. Formally, in writing, he looked at her steadily. You've delivered everything you said you would, on time, at the quality I was told to expect. That buys something with me. He turned his horse and rode back down the drive. Marin stood in the cold and watched him go. The wind came across the open ground and moved her skirt and her coat and the loose strands of her hair, and she stood there until he'd cleared the gate, and then she went back inside. Clara looked up. Well, Harlan sent letters to 3 ranchers suggesting we're not properly licensed. Are we? Yes. Marin went back to her machine. Cobb came to tell me and to say he's writing back to Harlan formally. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's Cobb going on record against Harlan. Yes, Marin said, that's what it is. She sat down. She picked up the next piece in the order queue. Her hands found the fabric and positioned it and started the machine, and the rhythm of the work filled the space. And she thought about the letter in Cobb's coat pocket and what it meant and what it didn't mean. And she sewed. Wade found out about the letters the same day, not from Marin, but from Pearson, who came by the ranch on a different errand and mentioned it in passing with the tone of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and is not impressed by it. Voss is out of real ammunition, Pearson said. When a man starts writing letters suggesting regulatory problems with no basis, he's throwing what he has left. He's still got influence, Wade said. Less than he did in October. Pearson looked at the tack building, from which the sound of two machines running could be heard clearly through the walls. Built something real here. Real things are harder to undermine than he expected. Pearson left. Wade stood in the yard for a while, looking at the tack building and the bunkhouse and the Hollowell land around them, the same land he'd been looking at his whole life. The hills he knew by their winter shapes and their summer colors, and the particular way the afternoon light hit the north slope in October. The same land, but different now. Fuller somehow. More inhabited. He went inside and found Marin at the kitchen table that evening, with her ledger and a letter she was composing to the Territorial Business Office, a preemptive filing of her current licensing documentation, organized and annotated, sent without anyone asking for it, because that was how Marin operated. She didn't wait for problems to become crises. He sat down across from her and watched her write. After a while, she said, without looking up, Cobb's going on record against Harlan. I heard from Pearson. Pearson's going on record too? He didn't use those words, but yes. Wade folded his hands on the table. How are you feeling about all of it? She finished the sentence she was writing. Set down the pen. Looked at him. I've been waiting for the part where it falls apart, she said. That's honest. I've been waiting for the thing I didn't document, the thing I forgot to file, the thing Harlan finds that I didn't close. She paused. There isn't one. I think there actually isn't one. And I don't quite know how to trust that yet. You've been thorough. I've been scared, she corrected. Thoroughness driven by fear and thoroughness driven by confidence look the same from outside. From inside, they feel different. He looked at her across the table. And now? Which one is it now? She thought about it honestly, which was what she always did. Somewhere in between. Moving toward confidence. She picked up her pen again. Ask me in June. He almost said something. He stopped himself. Then, because he'd been stopping himself for 4 months, and he was tired of it, he said, Marin. She looked up. I'd like to still be in a position to ask you in June, he said. And September. And next January when the orders come back around. She was very still. I'm not saying this well, he said. I know I'm not. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for 2 months, and I haven't gotten better at it. He looked at the table and then back at her. My father's letter asked me to give you a chance. I don't think that's what this is anymore. I think this is something I'd want regardless of any letter. The lamp on the table sat between them, steady in the still indoor air. Marin set down the pen. She looked at him, not the careful look she'd developed for managing difficult conversations, not the measuring look she used when assessing a business situation. The other kind. The kind she mostly kept to herself. I'm not easy to be around, she said. I work too much. I think about inventory at supper. I file everything immediately, and I tell people no before they finish asking, and I haven't figured out yet how to stop expecting things to go wrong. I know all of that, he said. I've been watching you for 4 months. You've been watching me work. That's a lot of a person, Wade said. Especially you. She looked at the table. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to control. I don't know how to do this part, she said. I know how to do the work. I know how to negotiate terms and manage an order book and handle Harlan Voss. This I haven't had much practice, neither have I. His voice was honest. We'd probably be awkward about it for a while. Longer than a while, knowing me. That's all right. He said it simply, with the ease of a man who means what he says without ornamentation. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, ask me in June. About September and January. He understood that for what it was not a no, not a yes, but a not yet, but keep the door open, which from Marin was more than he'd let himself hope for. He said, I can do that. She picked up her pen. She went back to the letter. He stayed at the table, and neither of them said anything else, and the lamp burned steady between them, and outside the Wyoming night pressed in around the ranch walls, and it was enough. Spring came the way it always did reluctantly, in fits and starts, with warm days that raised your hopes and cold snaps that reminded you that the land out here had its own schedule and didn't particularly care about yours. Harlan Voss wrote no more letters. Cobb's formal written response had done what Cobb's formal written response intended to do it, ended the conversation in a way that left Harlan with no graceful counter. Pearson had said something similar, less formally but more directly, at the feed store in the presence of 6 other men. Harlan had heard about it, because Harlan heard about everything. He had absorbed it with his usual public composure and his private calculation, and he had, for the first time in anyone's recent memory, gone quiet. He didn't close his store. He didn't leave the territory. He continued to sell goods and manage his supply lines and operate the commercial interests he'd been operating for 20 years. He simply stopped engaging with Belrose Frontier Goods, as though it were a problem to be solved. Claire's interpretation, he's decided she's here to stay and he's cutting his losses. Ruth's interpretation, delivered while sewing and without looking up, he's waiting. Agnes Polk said nothing, which Agnes Polk's silence always meant she agreed with Ruth. Marin's interpretation, he's not our problem right now. The grain cover orders are. The grain cover prototype had been tested by Cobb in March, stored through a late-season wet spell, inspected afterward for moisture penetration, and had performed well enough that Cobb ordered 12. Marin had expected the spring sales to be slower than winter. She'd been half right. The blanket orders slowed. The grain cover orders picked up enough to fill the difference, and by April, she had enough combined volume to justify the second sewing machine she'd been saving toward since December. She bought it herself, with her own money. On a Tuesday in April, she went to the equipment supplier in town, with a bank draft she'd written from the Belrose Frontier Goods account, the account she'd opened in February, in the business's name. Separate from anything else, and she bought the machine and arranged delivery and paid the cartage fee and came back to the ranch and told nobody for the rest of the day because she needed to sit with it privately for a while. That evening, Wade noticed she was quiet. Good quiet or bad quiet, he asked. I bought the second machine today, she said. He was quiet himself for a moment. Then, with the business account. Yes. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know, the one that wasn't quite a smile but lived in that direction. Good quiet then. Yes, she exhaled. It's a strange feeling. Buying something you've been working toward for a long time. Kept waiting for it to feel bigger. How does it feel? Like I should immediately identify the next thing I need, she said. Which is probably what Orson meant about the pride getting in the way of enjoying anything. Wade smiled at that, an actual smile, which he did rarely enough that it was still notable. He said that? Not in those words, but close. She picked up her coffee. He said I moved through good things too quickly on my way to the next problem. I told him that's what kept me alive. He said it would also keep me from noticing when I'd actually arrived somewhere. Wade looked at her. Have you? Arrived somewhere? She considered it seriously, turning the question over the way she turned everything over honestly, without rushing to the comfortable answer. Somewhere, she said, not the end, but somewhere real. She set her cup down. The TAC building has 4 women doing work they're paid fairly for. I have an order book through July. I have a lease and a license and a business account and documentation on every transaction going back to October. She paused. And Orson's plan actually worked. Whatever he was thinking, when he stacked that canvas in Culver's back room, it worked. He'd be insufferable about it, Wade said, if he could be. He'd never say a word, Marin said. He'd just show up with something he'd fix that didn't need fixing. That was how he was insufferable about things. Wade laughed at that, a real one. Quiet and genuine, and Marin heard it and felt it settle somewhere in her chest in the particular way that a real laugh from a reserved person always did. Yeah, Wade said. That's right. That's exactly right. They went up to the grave on a morning in early October, a full year after the first time. Not because they'd planned it as a milestone. Marin had been thinking about it for a few weeks, and one morning she said, I want to go up to the hill, and Wade said, give me 20 minutes. And that was the whole of the planning. The hills were yellow again, the same dry autumn grass, the same October bite in the air. Marin carried wildflowers she'd picked from the edge of the south pasture, not formal flowers, not the kind you'd buy in town. Just the tough little late-season things that came up through the hard soil and were stubborn enough to still be blooming when everything else had given up. She knelt and placed them against the marker the same way she had a year ago, but it was not the same. She was not the same. The coat she wore had no patches. Her boots were new. Her hands, resting on the dry grass, were the hands of a woman who had worked hard for a year and built something real enough to touch. Wade stood behind her with his hat in his hands. After a while, she said, "I don't know if you can hear things from wherever you are. I don't think it works that way, and you weren't the kind of man who went in for that sort of comfort anyway." She paused. "But I wanted to say it out loud, for myself if nothing else. We did it. What you were trying to set up, it worked." She was quiet for a moment. "And whatever you were trying to do for your son when you wrote that letter, that worked too. You should know that." She stood up. Wade was looking at the grave marker with an expression she didn't try to read. He'd been working something through for a while. She could tell several somethings, probably, accumulated over a year of discovering things about his father he hadn't known. "I used to come up here and be angry," he said, after he died. "I'd come up here and I'd be angry because I didn't understand half of what he'd done and he wasn't around to explain it." He paused. "I understand more of it now. What parts don't you understand yet?" He thought about it. Why he didn't tell me, while he was still alive. That he'd done all this culver, the materials, the letter to the county recorder. He could have told me. Would you have listened? He was quiet. "I think he knew the answer to that question," Marin said, not unkindly. "I think he knew you needed to find it yourself, or it wouldn't hold." Wade turned that over. He nodded once, slowly. "That sounds like him." "It does." She looked at the marker. He was stubborn about the right things and wrong about the wrong things in roughly the same proportions as everyone else. He wasn't simple. I don't think people who are good are ever as simple as we want them to be. Wade put his hat back on. He looked at her. "Marin," he said. She looked at him. "It's been more than June," he said. She almost smiled. "I'm aware. You said to ask you in June." "You didn't ask in June." No, he'd thought about June and decided it was too soon, and then thought about July and thought the same. And August had slipped by while the grain cover orders were at their peak, and September had come and gone, and now they were standing on a hillside in October next to his father's grave, which was possibly not the most practical location for this conversation, but seemed, in some way he couldn't have explained, exactly right. "I'm asking now." She looked at him, at this man she'd spent a year working alongside, arguing with about business decisions, eating supper with, trusting with things she hadn't trusted anyone with in years. Not a simple man. Not an easy man. A man who'd shown up and stayed and not tried to fix anything she hadn't asked him to fix. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes to what, exactly? I want to be clear about what I'm asking." "You're asking if this," she gestured between them, not dramatically. Just a small motion that indicated the whole of the past year, and the kitchen table, and the morning coffee, and the honest conversations in the dark about difficult things, is going somewhere permanent. "Yes." "Then yes," she said. "I think it is," he nodded. He looked at the grave marker. He looked back at her. He reached out and took her hand, which he'd never done before, and her hand was rough-palmed from a year of work, and his was the same. And they stood like that on the hillside for a minute, not saying anything, because they were both people who didn't particularly need to fill silence. Then Marin said, "I'm keeping the business in my own name." "I know," Wade said, "and the tack building lease stays written separately from everything else. It stays exactly as it is. And when we disagree about something, we'll disagree about it," he said, "and one of us will be right, and we'll figure out which one and proceed accordingly. What if we can't figure out which one? Then we'll be in the same position as everyone else who's ever tried to build something together," he said. "And we'll manage." She looked at him. "That's not a very romantic answer." "No," he agreed. "It's an honest one." She thought about that. "I think I prefer it." "I know you do," Wade said. They stood on the hill a while longer. The wind moved through the dry grass, and the October sky went on wide and gray-blue above the territory. And below them, the ranch buildings were visible, the main house, the bunkhouse, the tack building with its 2 machines and 4 women who would be arriving at their work right about now. From up here, you could see how much space there was still. How much hadn't been built yet. Marin looked at it all and thought about Orson sitting in that kitchen with a piece of paper, writing a letter to a county recorder about a bunkhouse he wanted kept clear, planning for a woman he'd met outside a trading post and seen something in that apparently nobody else had bothered to look for. She thought about what it cost to see people clearly, to look at someone the world had decided wasn't worth much and say, I see something different. It cost attention. It cost the willingness to be wrong about what you thought you knew. It cost time, and most people decided they didn't have enough of that. Orson had been a difficult man, sparse with warmth, private about his kindness, not the father his son had needed in every way. But he had looked at Marin Belrose outside a trading post in the cold and seen her hands, and what she could do with them, and had spent the last months of his life quietly making space for that to matter. That was worth something. That was worth a great deal. She thought about all the women she'd dismissed, in her own mind, before she'd learned better, the ones she'd assumed wouldn't be capable, wouldn't stay, wouldn't meet the standard. Agnes Polk, who'd reorganized her supply corner in an hour. Ruth Gable, who sewed faster than any of them and said less than all of them. Dora Payne with her bad knee, who'd never once asked to sit down during a long day, unless the knee made it impossible. She'd almost missed all of them, because she'd been so used to being underestimated that she'd almost started doing it to others. That was the thing she'd had to unlearn, the hardest thing. You couldn't spend years being told you were less, and then turn around and see other people fully without working at it. The diminishment got inside you, shaped the way you looked at things, and you had to actively choose to look differently. Every time. Not once as a revelation, but repeatedly as a practice. She was still learning it. She expected she would be for a long time. They were married in March, the following year. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted a large wedding Marin, because she'd spent her life not asking for things she wasn't sure she deserved. Wade because he was constitutionally unsuited to ceremonies of any kind. They had the legal ceremony in the county recorder's office, with Webb himself as witness, which he accepted with the grave pleasantness of a man who understood that sometimes offices served more than their stated purpose. Clara cried. Dora Payne said it was about time. Ruth Gable gave them a set of leather-bound account books she'd tooled herself, precise and beautiful, which was the most Ruth Gable thing anyone had ever done. Agnes Polk brought food. Enough food for 15 people, though there were only 8 of them, because Agnes had apparently not been paying attention to the guest list when she cooked, or had been paying attention and had simply disagreed with it. Marin wore a dress that fit her, not a dress that someone had suggested she should be able to fit into, not a dress that accommodated some imagined future version of her. A dress for the woman she was, in the size she was, made from good fabric she'd selected herself and sewn by her own hands during evening hours over 3 weeks. Green, because she liked green. It fit her well, and she wore it without apology. She had stopped apologizing for her body somewhere around November of the previous year. In the way you stop doing something you've done so long, it felt natural gradually, and then all at once. And then you can't quite remember what it felt like to think it was necessary. Harlan Voss sent no congratulations. They hadn't expected any. Cobb sent a note that was 3 sentences long and said, essentially, that he wished them well and that his spring order would be arriving in the usual form. From Cobb, this was elaborate sentiment. Pearson showed up in person, unannounced, 2 days after the ceremony, with a handshake for Wade and a straight look at Marin that said, in the language of Ed Pearson's straight looks, more than most people managed in full paragraphs. Good work this year, he said. Thank you, Marin said. He nodded and left. She stood in the tack building doorway and watched him ride away and thought, good work this year. 4 words from Ed Pearson. She filed them away with the things she intended to keep. Above the first sewing machine, the one Orson had paid for and Culver had held in his back room, the one Marin had bolted to the heavy table in the bunkhouse. On the first day, she hung a small piece of wood that Agnes Polk had prepared without being asked, because Agnes paid attention to things that needed doing and did them. It said, in Agnes's clean, careful letters, let your work speak before the world decides who you are. Clara had asked where the words came from. Something I worked out over time. Marin said, which was true in the way that the most important truths usually were accumulated, not arrived at, built from the residue of years spent figuring out what actually held. The bunkhouse became the tack building, and the tack building became, by the following autumn, a proper workshop that Marin designed herself and Wade built with 2 hired carpenters, larger than either previous space, with windows on 3 sides for light and a separate room for pattern storage, and a long table at which 5 women could cut fabric simultaneously without getting in each other's way. Belrose Frontier Goods, not Belrose Hollowell, not Hollowell. Belrose. Wade had suggested this himself before Marin could raise it, which was one of the things that told her early, before she had other evidence that she'd made the right decision about him. The business grew at the pace that honest businesses grow not overnight, not in a rush of sudden fortune, but steadily, order by order, season by season, reputation accumulating the way sediment accumulates, one layer at a time, each layer making the foundation more solid. By the second autumn, there were 7 women working. By the third, 9. Some of them were like Marin had been capable, and passed over and carrying that particular weight that comes from having been told, for too long, that your capability was the wrong kind. Marin paid them fairly and expected good work and got it, because that was what happened when you paid people fairly and expected good work instead of expecting gratitude. She still thought about inventory at supper sometimes. She still filed things immediately and said no before people finished asking and moved through good moments too quickly on her way to the next problem. Wade had been right that June was too soon. She'd needed the full year, needed to see the business through a complete cycle, needed the March marriage and the Agnes Polk account books and Cobb's 3-sentence note before she could stand still long enough to let herself have any of it. She was still working on that, the standing still, the noticing when she'd arrived somewhere. She thought about Orson sometimes. In the morning when she unlocked the workshop, and the women were arriving, and the machines were starting up, and the day was beginning the way every working day began, with problems to solve, and decisions to make, and the particular forward motion of people who have something worth doing. She thought about a man who had seen her outside a trading post in the cold, and looked at her hands, and had said, "Come back tomorrow and bring your tools." She thought about what that costs to see a person clearly when the world has put a lot of work into making them invisible. How simple it sounds, and how rarely it happens. She had tried since then to do it herself. To look at the woman who showed up uncertain, carrying samples nobody wanted to buy, moving through a world that had already decided what she was worth, and to look past the story the world was telling and see what was actually in her hands. She didn't always get it right. She missed things. She moved too fast sometimes, made assumptions, brought her own tired history to situations where it didn't belong. But she tried. Every time she tried. That was all anyone could do in the end. Try, and correct course when you were wrong, and keep the door open for the next person who came around the corner of your life, carrying something the world hadn't yet decided to look at. The machines ran. The orders came. Outside the workshop windows, the Wyoming morning moved over the hills and the land, and the sky was the particular blue that only October made, and Marin Belrose, Marin Hollowell, on the legal documents. Though she kept the 2 names clear in her mind and used each for its proper purpose, stood in the doorway of the place she had built, and let herself notice it. Just for a moment. Just long enough to know she'd arrived. Then she went inside, because there was work to do, and the work was hers, and she was good at it. And that had always been enough. It had always been more than enough. She just hadn't known it yet. That first autumn, kneeling in the dry grass beside a grave marker with her hands pressed flat against the earth and her whole life still, somehow, in front of her. Now she knew. Wade found her in the workshop doorway that evening, the way he'd found her in doorways 100 times before standing still, looking out at something, her mind moving even when her body wasn't. Came and stood beside her. Didn't ask what she was thinking. He'd learned, over 2 years of marriage, that Marin would say what she was thinking when she was ready, and not a moment before, and that standing next to her while she thought was its own kind of conversation. The sun was going down behind the western hills. The light was the particular amber of October evenings in Wyoming, the kind that made even ordinary things look like they'd been considered. After a while, she said, "Ruth asked me today if she could take on an apprentice." "What did you say?" I said yes. Marin turned her coffee cup in both hands. A girl from over the Marsh Creek Road, 16. Her family doesn't have much. Ruth said she has good instincts with the leather work. She paused. I remember being that age and not knowing yet that the things I could do with my hands were worth anything. Wade was quiet for a moment. You're going to terrify her. Probably. A small pause. I'll try not to. You'll try. Whether you manage it is a separate question. She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead at the hills with the almost smile he did, the one that lived mostly in the corners of his eyes. Clara thinks we should offer formal apprenticeships, Marin said. Proper program, 6 months paid with a certificate at the end. What do you think? I think Clara is right, which is irritating because she usually is. Marin exhaled. It would mean more structure than we currently have. More record keeping. You love record keeping. I tolerate record keeping. There's a difference. She turned and leaned her back against the doorframe and looked at the inside of the workshop. The 7 women who'd been stayed late tonight, finishing the Cobb autumn order, the 2 machines running, the lamplight warm over the long cutting table. Agnes Polk at the leather bench doing something intricate without hurry. When I came here, she said, I didn't know any of this was possible. I thought I was coming to explain an old man's letter to his son and then go back to whatever came next. She looked at her hands. I didn't know what to hope for. I'd stopped hoping for much. And now? She looked at him. Now I hope for too much. Probably. Good, he said simply. She turned back to the amber hills. The light was going, the way light always did gradually, and then gone, and then the stars coming out one at a time over the dark Wyoming land. Orson would have liked this, she said. The workshop. The apprentices. Agnes reorganizing everything without asking. He'd have pretended not to notice how well it was going, Wade said, and then quietly fixed the fence line along the south pasture. As a comment, Marin laughed. A real one, quick and unguarded, the kind she'd gotten better at allowing. Wade reached over and took her hand the way he had on the hillside simply, without announcement. They stood in the workshop doorway while the evening came in full and the lamps burned warm behind them, and the women inside finished their work, and somewhere over the hill the grave on the rise sat quiet under the first appearing stars. And the land went on in every direction, wide and cold and entirely indifferent, except that people had built things on it anyway. Small, stubborn, real things. Things that held. That was enough. That had always been enough.